Like Ghana, Uganda stands on the cusp of oil exploitation. With years of effort by minnows, oil discovery led to early production in a set of fields along Lake Albert, with up to 3 billion barrels of reserve potential.
This will have a huge effect on Uganda. They've probably created a $40–50 billion net wealth effect on the economy.
Tanzania took years to sell acreage on land and in the deepwater Mafia Basin. Drilling is imminent. It produces only modest gas from Songo Songo field offshore to supply Dar es Salaam. In Zanzibar, complex politics and disputes with mainlanders have for a decade held back Shell's plans to sign 4 blocks in the Mafia Basin. Any oil or gas discovery would help Kenya. Alec Robinson's exploration company is looking for oil at Lake Turkana in the northwest of the country.
There's new technology that comes in that evolves over the very, very quickly evolves. The ability to get seismic in shallow water and extending from onshore into shallow water, as we need to do in Lake Turkana.
Somalia, a failed state, encourages few takers in a Mad Max world with prospective oil acreage, but more dangers than oil companies can bear. In the Horn of Africa lies the de facto statelet of Somaliland, where Ophir Energy and Africa Oil in Puntland seek discovery success.
In Somalia, we're in northern Somalia, which is called Puntland. So we've signed an agreement there. It's a little further removed from Mogadishu and some of the struggles they have there. Somaliland and Puntland are relatively quiet.
South Africa is Africa's largest liquids market. State player PetroSA's Mosgas GTL plant is running out of gas. A regas terminal for LNG imports is sought. Oil reserves are in decline. A new deepwater acreage leased around South Africa to BHP Billiton, recently Shell, has yet to be drilled. South African firm Sasol Petroleum International is busy in Mozambique.
Our gas in Mozambique is specifically, we could unlock that gas resource, which was not discovered by Sasol, and that is the interesting thing. It was discovered in the 50s and 60s by previous operators. What we brought was the market. And then we acquired the equity in the upstream. We built the pipeline to bring that gas to South Africa.
Mozambique really needs a significant oil find, as does South Africa, where the search is on for shale gas, with efforts to monetize coal bed methane reserves. In Zimbabwe too, coal bed methane exists, but retrograde politics and sovereign risks are extreme. Meanwhile, Madagascar holds large heavy oil reserves, and Omnis, the state company, has managed to lease extensive acreage.
Unfortunately, the last couple of years of political crisis in Antananarivo has not helped the industry. But the state company Omnis has carried on, if you like, holding the flag and looking to run a new bid round now, and also attracting the companies, and has done extremely well in this last 8 or 9 years to bring in companies. The heavy oil reserve base in 2 major accumulations is known and significant. It's billions of barrels of potential.
The Comores likewise has put up offshore acreage, but with no takers so far. The Seychelles is a large microcontinent in mostly shallow water, with blocks leased so far to a few small explorers.
And Seychelles has been into the business of oil exploration for some time now. But now East Africa being like a hotspot, companies have come back to Seychelles.
All African governments want more explorers, risk capital and oil firms to enter, but on their terms. Whatever happens, governments with their servants, the African national oil companies, will become more important. Provoking tectonic shifts in world oil and geopolitical realignment amongst global powers, resource nationalism has reshaped the landscape for most states, oil companies and investors in the 21st century. From Hugo Chavez in Venezuela to Vladimir Putin in Russia, governments worldwide have sought more control over oil resources.
I've seen it many times. I've seen the Middle East nationalized. I've seen Russia nationalized. We've now got a wave of nationalization going across South America. It tends to be a continent by continent thing. So far, Africa has not suffered as badly as, say, Russia or South America. In Russia, the nationalization wasn't so much government, it was private sector taking over from foreign investors. But either way, it was a loss of title to assets. In Africa, it's something we have to watch out for.
Terms and contracts are toughening worldwide. Proliferating interstate agreements have complicated and narrowed the playing fields open to private oil companies. Today, over 50 state oil companies worldwide hold assets outside their countries of origin, and 33 foreign state oil companies have upstream activities in Africa. More foreign players are in bed with African national oil companies, which seek larger economic rents from oil.
The countries want to give a fair return to the investor. What do the people of the country want to see? They want to see an investor who is well rewarded but not taking a lot of windfall to their side. Fiscal systems are developing that are allowing the balancing of this, and I think they should be pursued further.
African governments have upped the stakes in the oil game. Some have resource nationalism tinges to oil policies like Libya and Algeria. Nigeria too has begun to reshape the policy landscape. Most states want more for themselves extracted from the oil resource, assets and oil revenue pot, and so tougher terms apply.
I think this is part of the shifting dynamics in the world oil game that we've seen since the early part of this decade, a shift to what is popularly called resource nationalism. This is the state working its system, if you like, to improve its own state take, the share that it gets from government. And there have been cases where contracts have been overturned, not that many as people would imagine. More cases where taxes have been added, windfall taxes when prices have risen, for instance, and where other obligations have been put on companies.
African governments have tried to strengthen their grip on oil. They want a larger state take from revenues, tougher contract terms, stiffer local content rules, more interstate deals and a wider set of state-managed joint ventures.
In any country, what tends to happen is during the investment phase, governments are very friendly, but then as soon as you start making cash flow to pay off your exploration risk, then the governments sometimes and the media sometimes questions whether you have a right to make money out of their natural resource, and that becomes a risk.
Not all is right in the African house of oil. Nigeria has multiple problems. State company NNPC has been at times almost bankrupt. The new oil reforms designed for its resurrection on the lines of Petronas and Petrobras. Many a skeptic is found on its oil reform initiatives. NNPC lacks money and technology to exploit the large assets on its book. Nigeria is a case of much that remains wrong or ill-advised with state oil in Africa. State entities suffer from corruption, including in oil. A bid round strategy launched in 2005 largely failed. Then attempts to tie upstream block awards to downstream investments in power, refineries and infrastructure, and with preferences for foreign states, did not work.
I think Africa could do a lot better on several levels in terms of reshaping its state oil companies to make them more commercial. I think several of them could set up international overseas operating subsidiaries. Some of them are doing it, but not enough. The foreign state players in Africa have a much bigger portfolio in Africa and faster growing than the state companies outside of their countries of origin. Foreign state companies are at the moment relatively eating Africa's lunch, and if they're not careful, they will eat the dinner too.
A few African national oil companies have joined the push to go outside their own domains. Sonatrach from Algeria has been in Peru, Libya, Egypt, Cameroon, Mali and Niger. PetroSA took assets in Nigeria, Mozambique, Namibia, Equatorial Guinea and is looking to heavy oil in Venezuela. It is planning an $11 billion refinery of 400,000 barrels per day at Kucha in South Africa. Others have just started on this road to internationalization. ETAP in Tunisia, Namcor from Namibia as a bidder in Angola, EGPC in joint venture with Sonatrach, while ENH in Mozambique has a joint venture with Petro Vietnam. Most international of all is Angola's Sonangol, which has invested abroad with a flourish in the last few years into 2 fields in Iraq, the Gulf of Mexico, acquisition of Brazil's starfish and assets in Portugal. But most state companies remain tied to old structures at home and do not command their own budgets in cash. Like weak animals in the bush, they may be easier prey for predators. Africa has been in the sights of foreign powers for centuries. Now a global interstate oil charm offensive is underway. In exchange for oil, new state suitors provide a mix of investments, cash, diplomatic aid, soft assets, credits, infrastructure, deals, services and technologies. Often with patronage, presidential prestige and even armaments. It's a heady mix with new state oil explorers flooding Africa's hinterlands. At the turn of the century, around 1 million square kilometres in Africa was leased. Now it's over 6 million square kilometres, with around 2 million held by foreign state oil companies. It means the great oil game will be increasingly competitive in Africa over the next few decades. European states also seek bilateral deals for oil and gas. Many want to wean themselves from reliance on Russian gas supplies. They look to North Africa, close to southern Europe, with large gas reserves and pipelines across the Mediterranean.
Yes, Africa is now recognizing its discovered resources in gas and the potential for discovery of more. You've got several LNG projects now in Egypt. You've got them in Libya, got them in Algeria, got them in Equatorial Guinea, of course many in Nigeria, Angola coming to market. And with the East Coast gas discovery, if there proves up to be sufficient commercial gas, that potentially might go to the East Asian markets.
Private Europe-based companies like Shell, BP and Total rely heavily on Africa's oil and gas. Europe's state companies are active as well, such as Statoil in Angola, Tanzania and Libya. American interests reflect in the larger footprints of their independence. Annual US investments in Africa's upstream were under $1 billion in 1980. Now they exceed $15 billion, including in gas and LNG. Washington wants at least 25% of its crude oil imports from Africa by 2015. Its independents are found in almost all African states. Their expertise, technologies, capital and management offer state-of-the-art skills that Africa needs to develop its oil future. But it is China and its triad of state oil companies that have made the fastest running of late. Today, around 1 million Chinese live in Africa. Much of this China investment interest is about resources and oil.
China already plays a significant role in the oil and gas sector on the continent, in essence in 2 roles. One is as a service provider and one is as a resource buyer.
African states and elites welcome investment and oil deals from Beijing. Already, over 33% of China's crude imports come out of Africa. This will rise in future. Sudan and Angola are large suppliers to China. China's state oil players have entered into more African countries. Many get Chinese investment and infrastructure in return for oil resources. Chinese projects in Africa's oil will grow sharply as Beijing state oil companies target more assets.
I can just say that they stepped up to the table when nobody else wanted to step up to the table. They get criticized sometimes to maybe overpower certain countries, but they're spending a lot of money here.
China's CNPC, CNOOC and Sinopec command a growing oil asset base across Africa. CNPC, PetroChina, dominates Sudan. Recently, CNPC was given $50 billion to acquire foreign oil assets, and Africa is high on its shopping list. Sinnock is an oil producer in Nigeria's deep water, has acreage in Morocco, Equatorial Guinea and onshore Kenya. It entered Tullow's Ugandan oil stakes in 2010. Sinnock's ambitions are large, global and embrace Africa as a whole. In 2010, it wanted to acquire 6 billion barrels of reserves in Nigeria, plus a slice of discoveries in Ghana and acreage in Somalia. In 2009, Sinopec bought Arax, a Swiss independent, for $7.2 billion to widen exposure and production in Nigeria and the Gulf of Guinea. The Sinopec-Sonangol joint venture is a major oil investor in Angola. With China's foreign exchange reserves at over $2.5 trillion, there are likely to be many more oil deals.
The Chinese footprint in Africa is large. It will grow. China's a huge crude importer. That import requirement will grow, and Africa will be a key resource base for the Chinese relationship.
India does not want to be left behind and today draws 15% of its crude imports from Africa. It has mimicked China's courtship of Africa, held India-Africa summits and developed incentives for African state oil firms. India's ONGC is found in Sudan, Côte d'Ivoire, Libya, Egypt, Nigeria and Gabon, and is looking at Algeria, Angola, Niger, Chad and Mauritania. But still India lags China in African oil assets. As the China-India rivalry continues, and it will, Africa will be one key battleground. The Russians, long players in Cold War Africa, are back. Then it was ideology. This time it's all about business and commercial edge. Russian state companies Gazprom and Rosneft have invested more and more into Africa over the last decade. Theirs is a long-term game. Gazprom's interests are growing. It's a global gas giant and it wants a global portfolio. The company holds interests in Algeria, Libya, Namibia and deals with Equatorial Guinea. It may have an eye open for a potential groundbreaking corporate acquisition on its radar screen. Russian companies are on an oil quest in Africa. This man has set up an oil pipeline company in Cape Town.
Like the pipelines, yeah? It is going, I think in the coming 3-4 years, will be at least 5,000-6,000 kilometers of pipelines built, which is a big figure, even worldwide. For Africa, it is very big figure.
From around the world, more oil companies are coming into Africa. More state players are on an African oil safari from Chile to Turkey, Norway and Kuwait, and from Southeast Asia, Indonesia, Vietnam, Thailand and Korea. Brazil's Petrobras has large portfolio in Angola, Nigeria, Senegal, Libya, Mozambique and elsewhere, and is a world-class deep water operator. Even Cuba holds a slice of Cabinda, as does Iran. Hugo Chavez from Venezuela seeks enhanced oil ties with Africa. Ultra competition is the future.
If you took the total capital inflow into African oil and gas the year 2000 at a particular number, you'd be looking at somewhere around 4 to 5 times as much now. Just in the case of Angola, for instance, they're expecting in the next 5 years to see a $50 billion investment inflow. If you add these numbers up on a continental scale, oil, gas, LNG, these numbers are rocketing. And we expect that there will be, over the period 2000 to 2030, anywhere from $1.5 to $2 trillion of investment inflow into African oil, gas and energy.
With the infusion of new competitors into Africa's oil game, more interstate alignments are underway, strategic economic balances are shifting, and African governments are tilting to the east. Africa once again has become the frontier opportunity. Very few wish to be excluded from Africa's fast-growth oil world. More More than 600 oil and gas companies explore in Africa, and the numbers are growing fast. Separate investor holdings, interests or equity shares have risen sharply from 1,500 in 1985 to over 3,500 now. Duncan Clarke does a Scramble for Africa strategy briefing each year in Cape Town and monitors the industry. He estimates there could be well over 900 companies involved in Africa's upstream by 2020. More oil companies, too, are nowadays born in Africa. African independents today come from 20 countries, from Nigeria, Angola and Kenya to South Africa and Tunisia. These companies shape an enlarging chunk of the continent's economic growth. At the top of the corporate oil food chain are super majors, large Western oil players with capital funds, technologies, long experience and substantial portfolio in Africa.
The big five animals, if you like, the ExxonMobil, Total, Shell, BP, Chevron. They stand out in terms of scale, history, market capitalization, depth and scale of portfolio and spread across the continent, although they're quite concentrated on their focus areas. Then we have what we call the super independents, 25 companies that are sitting between, let's say, $20 to $100 billion of market capitalization, but also have a significant, important footprint. You could mention here, just amongst them, BG, BHP Billiton, Anadarko, Sasol, for instance.
Anadarko drilled with success in Ghana and offshore Sierra Leone, opening a vast zone of promise, and it has discovered a large gas field, the Windjammer, offshore Mozambique. Independents or minnows proliferate across Africa's vast spaces. Tullow stands out with a wide footprint. Having 800 staff, the Irish-based minnow had a tiny gas field in Senegal before buying Energy Africa Limited, then Hardman Resources, to be valued now at around $17 billion. This was a 20-year effort. Many were not so lucky. Africa's oil graveyard is not short of casualties. Cosmos Energy, a small player from Dallas funded by private equity, took acreage in West Africa and struck lucky in Ghana in the Jubilee oil field. Afrin, formed by Dr. Rilwanu Lukman, the former Minister of Petroleum in Nigeria, raised funds on London's AIM, built assets in Nigeria and went into the Gulf of Guinea. Now it is an oil producer with a widening portfolio created in just 7 years. While Africa's frontiers offer potential, minnows have limited capital and capacity. They need to raise risk capital, equity, for costly, risk-prone exploration.
Exploration usually requires buoyant financial markets to happen. The reason for that is that frontier exploration is led by small independent oil and gas companies where there's the potential for a very large return, so it attracts high-risk equity capital. That dries up when there's a downturn such as we've just had in the equities markets. For exploitation, it's easier to raise capital. You can raise debt against the assets. You can go to public markets and do bond issues or equity issues.
Typically, the small companies have broken open frontier countries. The most forbidding and risky frontiers in Africa lie in deep water. It takes savvy, financial muscle, perseverance and guts to play the high-cost, high-risk deep water game. While some succeed, many fail. Deep water blocks cover larger chunks of Africa's exploration landscape, yet vast deep water areas remain open. So the exploration game in Africa has decades to run, while independence will largely shape its future.
Below that, we talk about the worldwide independents. They come out of all sorts of stables. They come out of every continent in the world, from Australasia to Asia to East Asia to Russia to Europe to the United States to Latin America. And you've probably got a category of a couple of hundred of these players. Some are pure explorers, others have moved into discovery, development and production.
No one has pursued the elusive large elephant discoveries in deep water with more ardour than Gene Van Dyke, president of Vanco Energy from Houston with 55 years in the game. It took 15 years of costly effort through Morocco, Ghana, Cote d'Ivoire, Gabon, Senegal, Namibia and Madagascar until Vanco finally struck lucky in 2010 in Ghana. Afia Energy, likewise, from Perth, holds deep water blocks around Africa and has discovered gas in offshore Equatorial Guinea. The future of deep water pioneers in many African states depends on the symbiosis of such partnerships. African-born, bred and finance companies too are part of the scramble for Africa's riches. Around 150 born-in-Africa oil companies from 20 countries now hold acreage and assets. Nigeria's Oando, quoted in Lagos on the Johannesburg Stock Exchange, operates across the value chain. It is